Karibuni, karibuni, karibuni. Thank you all for joining us again on Kumbukeni. Asante, Brother Alimadi, Brother Adesoji. I'm so used to calling you Milton now. I almost threw myself off with that AA. Brother Milton and Brother Adesoji, if you could please introduce yourselves. My name again is Nduku. I am one of the co-hosts on Kumbukeni. We are excited to talk about today's topic and to remember this part of history. Brother Adesoji.
Yes, Adesoji Ginla is the name, as we will say in Yoruba, Kudedewoyi, and reaching you from the center of empire as usual, London, the capital of imperialism. Nobody does imperialism like we do it. So
you do have a special touch.
Yes.
History has shown that you do have a special touch.
Without further ado, I'll pass you over to Brother Milton.
Yes. No, but I'm proud of the brother to survive and maintain your sanity.
Listen, Alimadi, don't cut us short. We have some struggling to do too, yourself and I.
Actually, we do.
Yes.
Yes, comrades. Welcome once again, Milton Alimadi, based here in the United States, the world's premier power, and also the world's premier declining power.
I was about to say you need to come back from that.
Yes, declining power. And as a consequence of that, we're actually living in very troubled world. We are at that moment when Britain realized it was a declining power and was causing havoc all over the world, not wanting to rearrange its relations with the rest of the world.
Go quietly.
That's a good juxtapose.
No, it's true. It's true. And now we're seeing the same episode, the United States. So, that trembling is affecting all of us, unfortunately. But today our focus, of course, is on the Soweto. The Sharpeville Massacre, which is a precursor to Soweto later, and to our comrade Robert Sobukwe. So welcome, sisters and brothers. Back to you, Sister Ndoku.
Thank you. Before we start, I just want to share with our audience, I attended the Walter Rodney, the annual Walter Rodney Foundation Symposium on Friday. It was a great experience. It was good to be with fellow Pan-Africanists, fellow revolutionaries, people who understood that we cannot be silent anymore. It was great to listen to the keynote speaker, Angela Davis, someone I have admired for a few years now. I have stories to tell about my encounters with her in my head. That is, we haven't yet met, actually. And it was great to hear her speak, and she is true in person to who you read about. I'm currently reading her autobiography, so that was great. It was great to be with the Rodney family. It felt like I was part of them, despite the fact that that's the first time I'm meeting them. It was good to see Mama Rodney and just hold her, to hear the story, because they did show the premiere video of Walter Rodney, what they don't want you to know. And it felt like family. It honestly felt like we were attending an event, because we were celebrating his birthday, which is on March 23rd. It felt like we were attending an event with family. And when I left, the only thing I regretted is that we didn't have more time together. So I look forward to attending other symposiums. I do have the website right up here for all of you. Please do support them, walterrodneyfoundation.org/take-action. That is where you will find recommendations on how you can support them in what they're doing. It is a high time that we as Pan-Africanists join our efforts in our liberation movement. Okay, so moving on, today we are talking about, and I don't know why I have a smile as I introduce this subject, but I guess it's the joy inside me. We're talking about the Sharpeville Massacre and the legacy of Robert Sobukwe. Someone I came to know, this is a little aside, myself, Adesoji, and a couple other students were attending Alimadi's history class, We Love Africa. That's how we started Kumbukeni, from that class. And I remember when we covered Robert Sobukwe, Alimadi would assign us different readings, videos, a lot of readings and videos per week to study certain subjects. And and this is while we're working full time and doing other things. So, and we encountered Robert Sobukwe, and I hadn't encountered him before that. And it was a shame that South Africa has hidden this history. So we, in support of South Africa and the rest of Africa, are going to remind you of this, for those of you who don't know about him. Brother Adesoji, when did the Sharpeville Massacre happen and why?
Well, we have to put everything in context. You're talking during apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
We started in the early 50s, technically in the early 50s, and with a whole raft of racist laws. And one key element of that era was the notion that in order for you to move around, you needed a pass. The locals call it the Donbass. And essentially what the pass said was you needed a pass to be able to even do the most benign of things, which is just walking down the street. Your pass needs to be on you so that they can tell where you are, where you've been, and what have you. And suffice to say, people have been living under such conditions for a while until matters came to a head. And how did that happen? There was a gentleman. Okay, the ANC was the prima facie united body of resistance, as we would know it then. But then they were not quite moving at the pace at which the people wanted. And when I say the people, especially led by a man who would know as Robert Sobukwe, otherwise commonly known as Prof, because of the way he moved, he smoked a pipe, he looked at sort. So he then broke away from the ANC, saying he wanted a body that was much more African-centered and Pan-Africanist. Now, those two tags are very important. African-centered and Pan-Africanist. Why is that important? It's important in the sense that the ANC was an umbrella body for everybody, and basically they were making rules as they went along. So there was no clear purpose of action. So it was more speech making and what have you. But the Pan-Africanist was much more people-centered. It was like, okay, what do we do?
Yeah.
So one of the course of action was the demonstration, the leave your pass at home demonstration. So essentially, they were asked, leave your pass at home, go to a police station nearby, and declare yourself pass free.
Yeah.
Knowing fully they were going to be arrested. So this spread across South Africa. And one of the key places where it was picked up on was in Sharpeville. There were 30,000 people came out. The police came and met up, and it then transpired what we're talking about, which was essentially the gunning down of people. And there was one key aspect of it. There was not any point in time that the people were a threat to the police, but the police wanted to disperse them. And because they felt if they didn't clear them out and they built up, eventually the whole system might be upended. And so in doing that, they shot in the air once, and once the people scattered, they started shooting them in the back.
Yeah. We do have to emphasize that it was a peaceful demonstration. No one was carrying any weapons, and they actually came to submit and to offer themselves up for arrest, because what they were saying, and just before I say this, I'm going to say this, Philip Nkosana, I can't say the Nkosana, the PAC national organizer, in the video, Robert Sobukwe, a tribute to integrity. And I shared it in the chat for those of you who are interested in watching the video to learn more. He says that he remembers in 1957 as many as 368,000 Black Africans being arrested and charged under one or any other aspect of the pass laws. That's an average, and he says this, he adds this, it's an average of 1,000 Black Africans a day being arrested because of past laws. So you can imagine the pressure this is putting on the people, and they have to stand up. And he says they decided to take final decisive action against the past laws.
Before Brother Milton adds to it, there's a key part in a movie, in I think it's Malcolm X, where the policeman comes out and says, "I need you to move your crowd," and Malcolm X waves the finger and everybody leaves. There's actually a scene in one of the demonstrations, although not on camera, but was recounted, where a gentleman, when they came to Cape Town and they had about 30,000 in the crowd, one young guy got on top of a van and literally said, "Oh, you're gonna have to move these people, not unless you agree that I speak to the minister in charge." When the minister then agreed, when the minister then agreed, he then took the bullhorn and turned around to the people and said, "Go home." And people literally, as soon as they heard that, literally just dispersed as quietly as they came, to show the unity of people and the voice of reasoning.
Which
that
is
sometimes
essential.
Sometimes you don't need violence. So, Brother Milton, sorry.
We're going to go down that line, that we don't need violence. We're going to detour and move to a different direction, because I am one of the co-hosts on Kumbukeni, and because it really did happen that way. Brother Ali Mahdi, who organized this campaign, and can you break it down for us?
Okay, good. So let me add to what Brother Desoji said. The person he described at the very end of what he said, that was Philip Kosana, 23 years old at the time. And they deceived him. So they promised that he would meet with the Minister of Justice or Interior. And of course, they ended up arresting him after he had dispersed that powerful crowd. That was really a moment, the kind of moment that Sobukwe was hoping for, because his plan, which was a bit disappointing, was that not all the turnout was like the turnout at Sharpeville. He had hoped it would be a national outpouring of that magnitude, and that the system would be overwhelmed and the system would actually eventually collapse using their own laws, by defying the laws. Let millions of people show up at police stations. And obviously, once you have them mobilized and outside, that's a moment where you can actually push on the revolution. And ironic, if you look at it in retrospect, obviously we have the benefit of retrospect now. Had social media existed at that time, that was a moment of revolution. So now the irony is that in those days, they had some of the sharpest organizers, but obviously they didn't have the kind of technology we have today to mobilize. They were able to mobilize tens of thousands using flyers, old school, just print flyers and distribute, and go and talk in communities and mobilize. So today we have all the media platforms of mobilizing, but some of the organizers are not as sharp as back in the day. And the issues have been made a little more confusing. Just like in this country, in the 60s, the struggle was clear cut. When they had the signs, no blacks allowed, whites only, right? So it was easy to mobilize, get people roused up and go for it. Same way in South Africa back in the day of apartheid. As you said, it became formal policy in 1948. But of course, the dispossession started, in the 17th century, when they came and they kicked African people off the land, stole their land, stole their livestock, committed massacres, encountered resistance, of course. So this was the continuation of resistance that started when the Europeans first landed in the 17th century. Sobukwe had been a member of the ANC. But as you said, he felt the ANC did not have a clear-cut agenda because I don't think he opposed it because it was multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial. But he thought that the leadership had to be African. And how did he define African? He said men and women who were willing to subject themselves to the African majority and the agenda that they set. So to him, whoever was on the top leadership, the executive board, was very critical. So he broke with the ANC. He had been with the ANC even when he was in university, Fort Hare, as a youth member. So the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, was formed in 1959. And effectively, it still exists, of course, but effectively existed for 1 year. Because 1960 was the Sharpeville protest. And by the way, this issue of tagging African males, first it was male, and then 59, 60 women as well, was not confined to the racist regime in South Africa. It was under all the other colonies as well. In Kenya, for example, you know, they had the, what was it called? Kipande system.
The Kipande.
Exactly. Where at the age of 16, exactly, at 16 as well, they wore dog tag collars.
Yep. You heard that right.
That this one is eligible to be forced into labor. You see? So they had that as well. And of course, very humiliating in your own country, you know, to be subjected constantly to stop and frisk. You gave the figure of few hundred plus. Some years, actually, the numbers were more than 1 million. Imagine. And you're arrested. You don't have your passbook. You either pay a fine, which of course they couldn't afford. So automatically you're taken to a farm to provide free labor. So this was another way of extracting slave labor. You're taken away, you know, from your family or from your job.
To be exploited.
Because of that, to be exploited for your labor. So of course it was widely resented, you know, in their own country. So they mobilized, as you said, they came to Sharpeville, and 70% was shot in the back. So obviously it meant they were killed when they were actually running away. They were fleeing, you see. And you mentioned Philip already, and that of course was a moment when the regime was shaken up, maybe pushed it further. It might have resulted in more spontaneous protests all over the country.
True.
And maybe even helped to bring the system down. So what happened is the regime acted very ferociously, arrested all the top leaders. And that was part of what, in retrospect, people said the PAC should have done in a different way, to have some of the leaders go underground in advance of something like that. So by being able to literally cut off the head of the fish. If you've seen, you know, the Battle of Algiers, right? By Pontecorvo, you'll see the strategy was to go for the top leadership, right? One by one.
And Brother Libadi, you mentioned that as an aside. Is that a movie or a documentary?
Yes, it's a movie that if anybody has not yet watched, of course, you must watch if you want to know history of revolution. The film was about the Algerian FNL resistance against the French, the Battle of Algiers. It's a dramatization of the liberation struggle, but it was so effective that it was banned in France. It was made in 1966, but it was banned in France until sometime in the 1970s. So I recommend that, and that's how they went after the leadership of the PAC. Sobukwe himself, you know, he was a lecturer. They would not give him a full title of a professor, of course, because as an African.
He's an African, yes.
Yeah, he was a lecturer at Witwatersrand University. He was arrested. He was convicted of incitement, sentenced to 3 years, But then they passed a special law just because of him, the Sobukwe Clause, which gave the Minister of Justice the power to renew his detention.
Imagine that, a special law for an
special
individual.
law for one individual.
This is how hateful this folk are.
Perpetually. But after 6 years, he was released, but then he was confined under house arrest for the rest of his life. And he joined the ancestors in 1978 at only the age of 54. Which was, of course, a serious loss, devastating loss. Now, when you look back and you wonder if a person like Sobukwe had lived, you know, if a person like Biko had lived, where would South Africa be today? Because, of course,
where would Africa be today?
Where would Africa be today?
Very
good. Thank you for that correction. Thank you. Because South Africa can influence the entire continent. So that's a good point. Sobukwe inspired Biko. And you can say Biko inspired the current generation, like the Nelson Julius Malema's, correct.
Julius Malema, yeah.
Yes. And one other point I would like to add, I think that this gives you you can understand the power of a person like Winnie Mandela, right? Because when Nelson Mandela was locked up after the Rivonia trials, given the life sentence, who kept the fire?
His wife.
Alive and visible within the country? It was Winnie Mandela.
His wife.
The PAC did not have a person who was comparable to a Winnie Mandela. And now you see the difference between their fortunes as well.
Yeah.
When the ANC increasingly became more prominent and the PSC.
The thing I'll jump in there in defense of Sobukwe's wife, Alimadi, is her role in society. She wasn't an activist like Winnie Mandela. She wasn't a revolutionary activist.
Oh, no. And I'm not criticizing her, by the way.
No, yeah. But just for anyone who might decide to go into that rabbit hole and ask, why did Sobukwe's wife not do anything? And she was participating in small ways and also, let's not forget, she wasn't getting, there's media too that made Winnie Mandela a household name.
Correct.
And not in a good way. But continue, brother. Sorry.
Correct. No. I think that's a very good addition. And I'm glad you caught that, because we didn't want to give that impression.
And there is, I would also like to add this reminder about Sobukwe when he was under detention in Robben Island.
Yes.
When the guards used to walk past, and because they couldn't speak to him, he would, just so that he know that he's still with his wits, he would grab some sand from the floor and they would let it slip through his sand, effectively saying the land belongs to us.
Yeah.
So every time they see that, they know Sobukwe was still around.
Right.
So, and it just goes to show that you can take the man. I mean, our brother says, Brother Sankara says you could kill a man, but you never kill the idea.
Right.
I think that's probably where he got it from, because Sobukwe represented what the ANC should have become. Because we were saying it beforehand that the ANC is actually Pan-African by circumstance, not intentional. Because from the onset, the PAC were Pan-Africanist in outlook and Africanist in ideology.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the ANC now, basically just floating around rudderless. They've got power.
I don't think they're rudderless.
No, careful not to offend as we continue to remember
they're not rudderless. They know exactly what they want, which is money.
Yeah. I know, exactly. But then, in the interest of the people, they, in the grand scheme of things, they're rudderless.
Right.
You're in power, but you're not using that power effectively.
Yeah.
Right.
So that power is constantly being eroded.
They've abandoned the vision. Totally.
I also want to add that just to emphasize on this point of Sobukwe leaving ANC is because Sobukwe believed that it's important to have an all-black, all-African, Black African organization, because he said that the struggle has to be done without interference from either so-called left-wing or right-wing groups. And this is happening today. We see in the United States of America, where we as Black people have been working on our liberation, but because we keep involving people who, to them, it's not their best interest to see our liberation, it's going to cost them, and some of them don't want that. And we keep involving them. We keep sitting at the table with people who are oppressors, thinking that they're going to give us liberation, which is, when you think about it, a defeating action. So this is what Sobukwe is saying. We need an organization where it is just us, so that we, Black people, can decide how we're going to fight for our liberation, so that we can decide what we want, not be told by others what we should want. So I think that's important to note there. That's why he left the ANC, because ANC was accommodating other interests.
Right. And that, of course, is not unique to South Africa. We see and saw that even in this country, where, when it came to the Black liberation struggle, there were so-called progressives who wanted to nominate themselves as the speakers on behalf of the struggle. And of course, to people like the Black Panthers, that was unacceptable. So you can see the Black Panthers, when the emergence of Black Panthers, you can see that and compare it to emergence of a person like Sobukwe in South Africa, and ultimately the Black consciousness movement under Steve Biko in South Africa as well, tremendously inspired by Sobukwe. And in fact, if you read I Write What I Like, the book by Steve Biko, and there's also a speech, not a speech, really, an interview, a short interview of about half an hour. You can find that on YouTube. Anybody that's interested, Steve Biko interview, and you'll find it. And he's also explaining that challenge that they face. So he said, for example, he found it contradictory that the leadership of the student organizations in the universities in South Africa, were European South Africans. So then he said they were the children of those who were carrying out the apartheid policy, and yet at the same time they wanted to lead the struggle against the apartheid policy. So that seemed to him like a contradiction, and that is why he was part of starting another organization. I think it was the National Union of South African Students, NUSA, as opposed to the one that existed. I think it was South African Students Organization, SASO. And in the new one, he promoted Black African leaders into this organization. And he said, we need to articulate our demands and not have you acting as our spokesperson. So you can see the similarity between what was going on in South Africa and what was going on here in the United States as well, in that respect.
Exactly, which is still going on, which is why I feel the need to say this now. I'm going to detour a little bit from Sobukwe, but connected, because this is what he believed. To all, and excuse me, brothers, that I am doing this, to all the white people out there who claim they are allies, who claim they want to help the Black liberation struggle, step aside. That's the best way you can help. Do not center yourself. Do not bring yourself to the forefront. Do not act like you know better than those who you claim you want to help. That is the way you can help. And do not ask them to teach you how you can help. Go do your own research. This extends beyond Black liberation. It extends to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The fake stance, I'm calling it fake because there's no money or to back up that these people actually want to create diversity, equity, and inclusion for everyone. So this is for the white people who claim they want to help, step aside.
Actually, like I would amend that. I would amend that.
Go ahead, amend it.
I would say, because I have a comrade whom I've worked very closely with, He writes for Black Star News. And I've had these discussions with him. And this is what he actually proposes. He says, don't try to elevate yourself into leadership or to be the spokesperson, number one. Number two, when you go back to your European communities, and first, I'm very wary of using even, white or black, because at the end of the day,
thank you.
We are all from the same people that
so
came
Sobukwe
from.
speaks to that. We'll talk about it in a minute. Yeah, go on.
From East and Central Africa. So, but let's not let the social construct divert us. But this is what Ted Glick says. When you go back to your communities, don't be a passive person. When you hear anti-Black comments or jokes, don't laugh. Yeah. You are not a serious person if you laugh or you participate in that. Even if you're the only person who's willing to stand up and say, that's not funny, and tell them why it's wrong. If you see an African American who deserves a certain position getting pushed aside in the interest of a European American, articulate your objection. In other words, don't be an observer to injustice and then say you want to work against injustice. And he has many other examples. And when I thought about it, I said, now this is the kind of true comrade you want, because he's not acting in the struggle just because he's sitting next to you and you can observe what he's doing. But he's saying the serious struggle needs to be done when you're not being seen.
Exactly.
And it seems to me that enough people are not involved in the kind of struggle that Ted Glick is suggesting.
Yeah, when you're in the comfort of your community, your European communities, where you think you can get away with it, where a lot of them end up using the N-word and thinking it's okay and funny. Don't be that person who's doing that. Be consistent is what we're saying. The way you're going to be in our community claiming you're helping us, be consistent when you're in that other community. Adesoji, you have anything to say on that?
Yes, I was going to say, speaking of being seen, who else sees us more than the media? Because when this atrocity happened, it's instructive to know how the world press saw it.
Yeah. So I was going to get to that quickly before we get to the press. So yes, that's the foreign reaction. So I'll let you continue. What is the foreign reaction once Sharpeville Massacre happens? Go ahead, Adesoji.
Oh well, Milton Alimadi's favorite newspaper, New York Times, would have us believe that in a headline quote, it says, panic-stricken people fled in all directions as the police opened fire with rifles and machine guns.
Imagine that.
End quote. End quote. Now, the report does not stay. The report says, it goes into very, very gory details. But then there is one line there that jumps out at me. It says, the shots, which lasted several minutes, fell people like 10 pins.
Jesus Christ.
It likened them
minimization, the language.
It likened them to playing bowling.
New York Times, the conversation about reparations is going on now. New York Times, you need to talk to some Black people about what you can do to repair the harm you have caused. New York Times.
But of course, I would like to add the Times of London. The Times of London said, it called the massacre a calamity of unspeakable horror. I love how you use language. And he goes a step further and he says, we trust that the government of South Africa will at last recognize that apartheid is a cancerous growth, that it can no longer be tolerated by any civilized nation. Before I say more on that,
hold up. First of all, let's remember New York Times. I just remembered as New York Times is penning that, the writer who penned that, and as they take it to the press and release the paper, the civil rights movement is still happening in the United States, right?
No,
Yes,
I mean there is a way I'll tie that
right.
into.
In fact, I don't think you should refer to them as what was the foreign press saying. You know, they're
Okay.
all
But they're still
interconnected.
oppressing Black people in their country as they pen that, right?
It's a
Okay.
global system.
It's okay. I don't know how to say this, but
Say it as
we
plain
have.
and simple
Okay, so we have to say it. We have to say it any which way.
as it
Okay.
is.
I would like to add this, preface it with this first. Guardian on the next day, which is March 22nd, 1960, reported that South Africa has plunged into the greatest crisis of its history. As if the displacement of people the year before, the removing of people from land, taking stuff from them was not in itself. But the fact that you kill them
Right.
is atrocious. Now, here is where it gets very, very funny.
And as you seek dogs on Black people in your country, let's
Dr. Martin Luther King says, where is his statement? Okay, yeah. Dr. Martin Luther King says, the slaughter of people, he uses that term. He says slaughter should serve as a warning signal to United States itself.
Right.
In the middle of the civil rights struggle. Yes. Why is that important? The next day, the Mississippi Upper Chamber passed a resolution 45-0 approving the massacre.
Okay.
Not surprising.
Let's just pause on that. In the United States, as New York Times is penning their disapproval of what happens in South Africa, in Mississippi, some white, old, probably men, I'm sure there were some women there because they have not failed in supporting this, are sitting down to support that.
Yeah, they actually voted. They voted 45-0, which means there was no abstention, there was no dissension. Everybody agreed, and they even issued a statement afterwards.
And this is 1960. Let's not forget, this is not 1400s or whatever 1960.
Yes, they issued a statement, and the statement said, we endorse the massacre and pass a resolution praising apartheid because anything other than that would be a mixing of the races.
True. All right, but my own view on that is that that should not surprise us. We know how
it doesn't. The thing that
South was. This is the other point that we should actually look at. What did the United States government do? Because it's the United States government that needs to be held accountable.
Yes.
The racists in those backward provinces, we can almost predict.
Careful, Alimadi, careful. I had a man in Tennessee yesterday ask me if I'm going to go back to New Jersey to tell them that they're backwards. Careful. Careful.
Okay, but the United States government and United States corporations never withdrew from South Africa. You see?
To this day.
They are the ones who are actually enabling and financing apartheid. I mean, the economy shook for a couple of weeks. Like the first week alone, the stock market lost $300 million in 1960, which is an equivalent of almost $3 billion, today. But it bounced back. And the system endured. What did I say? I said endured in the past tense. Yeah. When you refer to the economic aspect, the system still endures up today. You see? So that to me is what was the very grave outcome, that the people that sacrificed their lives, the leaders, were either liquidated or arrested. The people who are profiting went about business as usual, continued to make their wealth. People like Mandela continue to be incarcerated. Young people continue to be killed in the streets. We saw another massacre, 1976 in Soweto. So I think, to me, the key question is, and that's why I think we're talking about Sobukwe today, because we don't think that sacrifice has been properly acknowledged in South Africa.
Compensate.
And how many Africans know who Robert Sobukwe is?
Sobukwe, yes. Yeah.
And that is part of the repair, Brother Milton, to honor those in our community who stood up for us, who sacrificed their own comfort, and to remember them and not let their names be buried, and to say their name every year. Say Robert Sobukwe's name on this day. Philip. Say their names on this day. Even if you're saying it yourself, you don't have to go to TikTok and say their name. Adesoji, you were going to say something. Before you do say something, Adesoji, I just put up this question by one of our viewers because it was speaking to what you're saying. It's not question and answer time, but it's speaking to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is that a direct quote that you just read?
Yeah.
So yeah, Karen, you got your answer. It was a direct. I mean, I knew it was, but I want you to actually say that.
Yeah.
But before you continue, also let me add one thing to what Brother Desoji said in terms of the comrade, with the sand.
With the sand, yeah.
Here I am. This is another thing that even the prison warden said. They couldn't understand why. I think he had like 2 pairs of shirts and 2 trousers. But every morning, or rather he would wash them in the evening, and every morning iron them, dress up properly, and then sit in front of the place where he was isolated at the cottage. And the guard said, as if he was going somewhere. And they couldn't understand that. But that's the will to live.
Yes.
And that's
the respect of yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how he maintained his sanity. He came back. Of course, they never released him. He was under house arrest for the rest of his life. But he was not going to surrender and just allow himself to die.
Mentally.
So yeah. So I'm glad you brought up that point.
Yeah, that speaks to his character. It speaks so much to his character. Yes. So we're talking about the foreign reaction, and we just got some of us shocked at the fact that in Mississippi, the government there sits down and pens, direct quote, "We endorse the Sharpeville Massacre."
Okay. I would further that by saying the response was 3-pronged. So one, you had the press doing what they do. You had the governments, and then you had the business community. Now, in the case of United States, the business community and the government were tied. Here was the thing. The US government at the time was seeking a listening base in South Africa. And one of the preconditions from the South African government was, okay, fine, we would allow you the base, but as long as there are no African Americans, not even Chinese, will be allowed bases there. Anytime the USS warships passed the Cape, the black sailors were not allowed to disembark.
Imagine that.
If they disembark, they will be harassed in the streets. So, going back to business, obviously money matters.
Yeah.
IBM immediately pulled out. They pulled out 2 days later.
Yeah.
One bank stayed initially, and that was Barclays Bank, which only then pulled out in 1986. Can you imagine? 1960 to 1986. They had a long think about it and then decided to pull out.
Yeah.
One bank went in 2 days after.
They saw the opportunity.
Guess which bank that was? Chase Manhattan.
I was about to say Chase and I didn't want to say it.
So Chase went in the day after.
The Rockefellers.
They saw the opportunity.
Rockefeller was one of the top officials at Chase.
Yes. So Chase Manhattan went in because what was the word they used? There was business opportunity. So, and then you then have to then start seeing how governments were moving. the United States, although in public, will criticize the apartheid government. In private, they would go because, one, they didn't want to lose South Africa with its minerals, which exactly is what Kamala Harris is currently doing in Africa, in Ghana, going to Tanzania, going to Zambia.
You know what? Hold on. Pause real quick. Because you threw that. I'm sorry. I cannot.
No. Because
you... Quickly, hold on. They're taking the black face to go to Africa to do their dirty work.
Yeah, because they know now with social media, you can't send someone who looks like them there.
And we're not going to let them get away with it just because it's a black face and she's pretty and we love Kamala Harris, but no.
Yeah, but how many people are thinking like you?
Right.
Well, I just let you know you cannot get away with it if you watch this video.
Right. I think our mission is to
highlight
uplift our, the consciousness, the same way that Steve Biko was doing in South Africa with Black consciousness. And it's a process. It's a process, but it's a process once you spark it, as Steve Biko found, it's unquenchable. At some point, nobody knew who Steve Biko was. How did he become Steve Biko? He started speaking about the things that were touching people and nobody was articulating. And I think that is in fact our mission.
Yeah. And
in time, our people will be in a position where they'll understand why Kamala is being sent. A
quick addition, as you say that, and Brother Adesoji, as we go back to you, please do not lose your spot where you are. I was listening to my first encounter with Walter Rodney was how Europe underdeveloped Africa in audio. Yes. I was driving to Mississippi to Alabama to go see the lynching museum, and I listened to it. And I read the book, the actual hard copy, because I like to write and to mark. But then on this trip, when I was going for the symposium, I was listening to the book and again on audio. And he says it is our responsibility, every single oppressed person, to learn about your history and to stand up and speak up against oppression. Every single one of you. So if you are Black, whether you drive a Maserati or you live in the hood, in the ghetto, it is your responsibility. Whether you take the responsibility is up to you, but I'm telling you right now, it is each and every one of your responsibility to stand up against the oppressive system. Brother Adesoji.
Okay, so yes, back to what I was saying. And the reason I use looking through the prism of government and business is important. And I'll continue to tie it this way. It was one of JFK's points man was saying, listen, if you do not condemn this massacre, you're going to lose military bases not only in South Africa, but in Liberia, in places like Nigeria, listening posts in Ghana, and what have you. So that was the only time, because at that time JFK was in power. So here was the problem. Do you pull out American businesses or do you allow them to just carry on? So while the United States condemned the massacre, they were not willing to go as far as the boycott, which would lend itself to why by the end of 1966, which is just 6 years after the massacre, the US investment in South Africa at the time rose to about $601 million then. Not to be beaten.
It's about $6 billion today. So it's good to put
exactly. Yeah. So not to be beaten. People started running in because they didn't want to miss in on the action. Britain also did what the United States did. They condemned on the floor of the UN the UN General Assembly, but did not boycott South Africa, allowing the likes of Barclays to run its business operations, HSBC will go in, Lloyd's will go in.
So they don't sanction when they're benefiting.
No. And so you had all the foreign companies. Germany was also very sly about it. Germany condemned them, right? Germany went as far as thinking about boycotting. But here was how Germany was a lot more sleeker. At the same time, between 1960 and 1966, at least 300,000 Germans were moving in to South Africa every other year. And with them, they moved in companies. Say about, the reports then showed about 300 German companies. So which means you can't not essentially sanction them because they're operating out of South Africa. They're not operating with satellite bodies in Berlin, Bonn, or Frankfurt or Munich.
Yeah.
So they were essentially part and parcel of, and lest we forget, they already had presence in Southwest Africa at the time, which is Namibia. So it was a continuation. And then one other country was Japan. Now, I mentioned the concept that they didn't want Chinese on
South African soil.
On South African soil. But why were they willing to trade with the Japanese? They were willing to trade with the Japanese because the Japanese bought their goods.
Yes.
And Japanese did not question how it came about. So much so that they gave them honorary white citizenship.
Ooh, what a privilege. You mean you can get that? How do I get that?
No, the Japanese were given honorary white citizenship.
I know, again, how does one get that?
Well, I don't know how they do it.
Black people were given that as well.
How can we get that? Like, where do I sign up?
I'll just like to...
There's no need for it now, but that was an important factor at that point. For example, black entertainers, celebrities, who the South African regime wanted to bring to sugarcoat the system, they would give them honorary white status for the duration of the time that they're in South Africa. Otherwise, they would not be eligible to stay in those hotels, which were for whites only.
Yeah.
So they land, they have the white status for the week that they're there. They can stay in the hotel, and then the minute they leave,
it's revoked.
It's revoked. But go ahead. That's what the brother was.
So with France basically sold them weapons, airplanes, Mirages, submarines. So much so that the prime minister during that time, Vosta, called France one of their most staunchest allies. Now, there is one other country that is missing here, Portugal. Portugal was annoyed about the other Western powers kicking up storm about the Sharpeville Massacre. Why? Because at the same time, they were doing something similar in Angola. They were actually killing black males on sight. So when Dr. King actually, volunteered to go in as a as part of the UN fact-finding mission to Lisbon. Sorry, I said Lisbon. To Luanda.
To Angola or to Sharpeville?
To Luanda. To Luanda.
Yes.
Because all of these events happened thereafter, after Sharpeville, right? Okay. So I will end with this. There is one episode that happened that seals everything. In Zimbabwe, then called South Rhodesia, because the United States formed an African committee, American Committee on Africa, as a fact-finding mission. The Zimbabwean, at the time, South Rhodesian government, led by Ian Smith, formed, Brother Milton was saying we should do something similar, but you will see the joke there. They formed an African Committee on American civil rights struggle. So basically, what they're doing is they're turning the focus back on the United States,
Right.
as in the treatment. That's the joke in itself. Not only are you treating Africans barbarically, but you want to go and put the focus on the United States. So they were basically using Africans as theater games, as cannon fodder, so that you can then say, oh, we did this, tit for that, tit for tat, But then, let me end with this. The reason the UN was a lot stronger then was down to the action of the UN Secretary General at the time, Dag Hammarskjöld. Dag Hammarskjöld was Swede. Was it Swede on Swede? It was from one of the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, Swedish.
He was Swedish, yes. So why was he important to this? He, on the floor of the UN General Assembly, said 1960 was the year of Africa. And he got a resolution passed on the floor of the General Assembly to say the United Nations General Assembly was going to do was going to put all efforts towards getting all African countries at the time yearning for independence, their true independence, which explains why 8 months from making that statement, his plane came down on the corner of Congo. But hey, the moment you get, and incidentally, it was also 6 months after he met Patrice Lumumba, who was also then killed after he left him. And he will also then, tragically meet a tragic fate, when his plane came down.
Yeah.
And that matter still remains unresolved to today. Actually, an open case, So yes.
So let's talk about now what happens. And before we go on, I just want to remind our viewers, again, this work takes time. Yep. You've seen the books I've listed there. 3/4 of those, not to minimize the ones that myself and Brother Milton have gone through, Adesoji by himself just going through those. So in order to bring accurate information, we have to go digging, we have to go reading, we have to go watching, and that takes time. And in order for myself, Brother Adesoji, Brother Milton, to be able to do this work so that like we said, it is our responsibility. So whether you subscribe or not, we will continue doing this work. But we are asking you, in order to make our lives easier and enable us to do this work, please do follow us. If you want to join our Patreon family, you get to experience many more videos that we're not showing on YouTube at patreon.com/Kumbukeni. Or you can subscribe right now on the bottom button, subscribe. Or you can go to youtube.com if you're watching this later, /@Kumbukeni1 and support us. So the more subscribers we are, the more we're able to generate an income. If we generate an income, we don't have to be caught up in the 9-to-5s where we're working for oppressive systems after all. But so Sharpeville Massacre has happened. Robert Sobukwe is arrested. He is imprisoned. A lot of South Africans, Black South Africans, have been killed. There's pain and suffering going in South Africa. What do they get? What they were fighting for on that day? Does South Africa finally get that?
No, of course not. It's a process.
Brother, we're talking about the past in specific. What happens? What's the progression? And what happens to those past laws?
The key thing that they realized was that this notion of peaceful resistance was a pipe dream. So that's what they got out of that. Both the ANC and the PAC formed armed wings. Poko for the PAC,
yeah.
and Umkhonto with Sizwe
Spear of the Nation.
They went into exile. They were trained in armed struggle, which they, by the way, they had already started, but now escalated. They were given bases in countries like Tanzania,
Algeria,
They
Libya.
started getting a lot of support from the Soviet Union then, from China, sending people to train in armed struggle, giving them weapons. So I think that's the most concrete outcome of the massacre at Sharpeville. And of course, it also launched eventually in this country the anti-divestment campaign, where young sisters and brothers, joined by their allies, would protest on campuses and at businesses, demanding the withdrawal of investment from South Africa. But when it comes to the governments, the Western governments really didn't do anything serious until Jimmy Carter became president in the United States.
Yes.
And then in 1976, with the support finally of the United States, the UN was able to impose
a full
arms embargo against South Africa. Continued, of course, trading illegally with other countries, doing even military exercise with Israel, getting weapons from Israel as well. And then, of course, in terms of some of the major events that we have to acknowledge in the struggle of South Africa, is the role of Cuba, which in every discussion about South Africa's liberation, we have
Thank you for adding that, Brother Alimadi. Thank you.
Yes. Without Cuba sacrificing its soldiers, first of all, Angola would have been led by Savimbi or Holden Roberto, the two CIA agents. It was because of Cuba intervention in 1975 that the MPLA under Agostinho Neto was able to form the first government. It was because of Cuba intervention that government survived in place. And ultimately, it was because of Cuba's intervention in 1987 and the Battle of Cuito.
And who is leading Cuba at this time? Who are the forefront?
Under Fidel Castro, of course.
Fidel Castro.
And who else is there?
The Battle of Cuito Cuernavaca was commanded by Fidel Castro over satellite phone. In fact, the South African Minister of Defense, I forget his name now, the Minister of Defense said he had never heard of anything like that in his life, that somebody could be in Havana commanding that battle. That South Africa, of course, lost decisively, withdrew from Angola. Angola was ensured its independence, withdrew from what was Southwest Africa.
Namibia, yeah.
Went home and realized, wait a minute, these guys might actually march into South Africa.
Yeah.
Let's release this guy quickly. So they released Mandela. And as they say, the rest is history. Of course, as Mandela himself said, that was only part of the political struggle. The economic struggle must continue. And that's what's going on in South Africa today.
Yes. So, Brother Adesoji, speak to the PASS bill. When does it happen? And what are the actions, including the Sharpeville Massacre, that take place before it happens?
Okay, so essentially the PASS bill was started in 1952. Yeah. So 1952 and will not stop until 1986. So that's a whole 34 years. In the course of which there was Sharpeville. 16 years later, there was the Soweto uprising, which is a matter for another day. We will do no justice to talk about Soweto fleetingly. But then again, that battle of Kumbukeni-Reclaiming essentially accelerated everything to the point where even the government knew it was no longer tenable. One, you're talking about people who have been trained with weapons. When you hear this refrain by Malema, when he says, "We have not given up our guns, we still have our guns," it's a reminder to say the training, they've not lost trust of what the training is. So they can still revert back to the training if they need to. So now the PASS, where did the idea of the PASS come from? The idea of the PASS was actually from the South, the United States.
So you want to say the oppressive system, the minority, the oppressive minority group of people in South Africa are taking notes from the United States of America.
Okay, it's a circle.
Okay, go on.
The Dutch settlers, by the extension, are cousins of the Germans.
Yeah.
And so they what's it called? Hitler's government, it came to the South to understand how segregation takes place. That notion formed the blueprint of what transpired. If you look at the South, the laws, in terms of the laws, the segregation bills, the everything, if you look at it and look at the apartheid laws, you will seem as if you're looking at a carbon copy. But you're not mistaken, because basically what they did was they looked at what Hitler promulgated. And Hitler, having taken it from the South at the time, basically it just continued. So, which is why when Mississippi said they approve, they're essentially saying, yes, you're working according to the blueprint. So what's that to,
Yeah. So this...
No, but even before Mississippi, the British had practiced it very well as well.
Yes.
Yes. Throughout the places where they were seizing.
Kenya being a very good example.
Exactly.
Well, we'll mention no names.
The camps in Kenya.
They practice. Yeah, they did practice in Kenya. They also practiced in South Rhodesia, which would then become Zimbabwe.
Right.
So again, it's all about empowering a minority within a majority.
Yes.
By making what should ordinarily be nonsensical law.
Yeah.
Because why would any human being need to tell you, I am going here? I mean, it's so ridiculous that you could be standing in front of your house without your pass on you and you'll be arrested.
You know, this reminds me, and again, this is another detour, but it shows you how connected we are. It reminds me of Angela Davis's speech on Friday. She's talking about how ridiculous things are normalized to the point where society ends up accepting them as normal. Yeah. And she was specifically talking about the prison system in the US. But this is one example where we all, as human beings in existence now in society, things that are horrible, things that if it's the first time you're hearing about it, you'll be like, what? But because you're in a society where it has been normalized, you accept it and allow it.
Sadly, to me, the prison system is not that shocking, because people tend to, criminalize people by saying, well, if they're behind bars, they probably did something wrong. But what about this one? Normalizing the fact that you can have billionaires in the United States, and down the block, you'll find people sleeping on the subway corner. You'll find people starving. You'll find people relieving themselves on the streets. And we say this is the greatest country in the world. That, to me, is even much more shocking.
Sometimes right outside the building in Wall Street, right outside the building where the money is being made, right there is a homeless person.
But that is more normalized, especially after you've lived in this country for a while. In the beginning, when I first came, I could find it shocking, because that's not the impression you would ever get in an African country, that there could be an impoverished European person alive in the world, right? But you see this here. So if you've been here long, you don't see that anymore. It becomes normal. You need to come from a very outside environment. Then you'll see that, wait a minute, how can people be defecating in the street? How can somebody be starving here in the United States? How could somebody be sleeping outdoors on a cold winter night? How could somebody be eating at a very fancy restaurant and probably dropping $500 before they
$60 steak. Leave? Don't forget how much the steak cost them.
Well, somebody is watching from outside the window, and that person watching from outside the window does not feel the urge to break in and grab some food, because that person won't behave that way, because in his mind, it's also normalized that this is acceptable.
That's their position.
Yeah, I've thought about this many times. That's why when you brought up that issue, and to me is the most shocking normalization of poverty and enrichment.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
I want to even push it further. Okay, those were past laws, right? Which essentially monitors your movement and what have you. Do we think it's gone away?
No,
it hasn't.
Indeed,
no, not even.
Go on.
Not even passports. In New York, you have stop and frisk.
Exactly, that's what it was in South Africa. Thank you.
In the UK, you have stop and search. In Nigeria, you have show me your papers. So this idea that things are gone is almost like, just like Brother Milton said it, we've normalized it. It's become the norm.
Yeah. And we can't fail to mention this one. That's the most distressful normalization. That apartheid supposedly officially ended in 1994 when Mandela became president. So we are talking almost, 3 decades now.
Yeah, thereabouts, yes.
That as we speak now, the three of us and people listening to us, that in South Africa, the 8% European population still controls 72% of the arable land. Just think about that. And that is supposed to be acceptable. And in Namibia, the same thing.
Yeah.
The less than 8% European population also controls 72% of the arable land.
I wanted us to do a little exercise of critical analysis. We talked about Chase coming into South Africa and calling it a good business opportunity. Why would a company do that?
Why not? It's a capitalist country.
No. Tell me. Okay, let me see if how I can phrase you brothers of mine. We listen. All right, let's go back to the drawing board.
There's a whole
Let me
book
see how I
called
can
Capitalism and Slavery.
Let me see how I can rephrase
every question.
In a situation where out of your own country, the United States is United Nations is condemning this. Let's forget about Mississippi, because Chase might have had an uncle in Mississippi who encouraged them to come for the business opportunity. But you're a bank in a country that is condemning this for the most part. And you outwardly say this is a great business opportunity. Forget about the morals. What in a situation, we're not even talking about morals, what's right, what's wrong. In a situation where in a country, the Black majority is uprising against a system that is oppressing them, there's an incident where a good majority of them have been murdered on the streets. White people or European descendants, people are fleeing out of South Africa because now they're afraid of their lives. Why would and a lot of companies, international companies, are fleeing because they're seeing that this is not a good business opportunity. So why would a company, a bank to be specific, see this? What are the factors that would make it think that this is a good business opportunity?
Okay, I would revert that question back to you. What happened when people were hosed down in Mississippi when trying to cross the Edmond? What's that name of the bridge again?
Selma. Oh, the bridge in Selma?
Yeah.
Edmund Pettus.
I forget the bridge, yeah.
So what happened? Is Chase not in this country?
Okay.
Yeah.
One more time, brothers.
I'm
trying to say what is happening in South Africa that they're going to exploit.
This is a better way to see
but
it.
Yes.
Let me say this, and then I think it will make more sense.
Thank you.
Business don't see borders. That's why it's actually a global system. It's a global system, and that's what Rodney spoke about consistently, that the only way to understand it is to see it as a global system with tentacles around the world. So there's no difference between the Chase being here in the United States, Chase being in apartheid South Africa, Chase being anywhere it's allowed to operate, Chase would go, because people need banking services, right? Chase, I don't know that history of Chase that well, but if you look at companies like Barclays, the banks that go way back, how did they make their money? Insurance companies like Lloyd's, how did they make their money?
Lloyd's of London.
Barclays financed the slave trade. So there's no issue of whether it's moral or immoral. With them, it's their business, fine. When at some point it was legal to trade in human beings, they were involved in it. Lloyd's was insuring those ships that was taking human cargo. So once you see all of that, then you realize apartheid is just a little sneeze in the global history of exploitation. If
for
they
me,
could finance.
For me, the thing I was hoping you would both get into is exactly what can they exploit in that moment. Is it that they're coming in because the government now is caught up in other things and there will be no regulation? Is it that they want to get access to the gold and the diamond? That's what I was trying to get us to.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. So Brother Milton just pointed it out. Now. After the Second World War, can you tell me which other moral war, in inverted commas, which other moral war has been fought? One moral war that's involved countries.
I would say none of them.
None of them.
Even those so-called world wars.
You know why? Because all of those wars have been fought on behalf of businesses.
Yep.
Seeking interest. When the interest is not forthcoming, you stir up trouble. You go and stand behind your power. Look at what happened in Iraq. Look at what happened in Iran. Look at what happened in Yugoslavia. Look at what happened in Congo, or what is happening in Congo. Yeah. So you could go down, even in South America, it was business.
Right. As one commentator said, war is business.
It's business, exactly.
Somebody just posted that.
Yeah, war is business. In South America, it was the United Fruit Company. It was the United Fruit Company. Even lately, I think a couple of months ago, what's his name? Elon Musk. When I think it was the Ecuadorian government were not allowing them access to the lithium mines, he said, and these were his words, we can coup anyone. So which means we can upstage any government. So if you go and look at the history of the wars after World War II, deep down you will see, you don't even need to travel far. Just pick up.
I don't think we should look at after World War II. World War II was a war of business as well.
Yeah, but that was more, that was territorial. Yeah, that was territorial. Because he felt the Treaty of Versailles he wasn't happy with the Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly.
So if you look at all it's only Africa that we moralize and we look at them and like, oh, why are you doing this? To them, it's a business opportunity.
Are you saying we shouldn't even bother with the asking of why? We should already know that they are exploiting.
Oh, definitely. And the more we read the history, we'll be in a better position.
The more, exactly.
And the people we're trying to enlighten as well. That's why, before we leave, I strongly, strongly recommend Capitalism and Slavery
by Eric Williams.
Yes. Because, and these are for people that are not that familiar. If capital could enslave fellow Europeans, then I think people would stop asking, too many questions like, wait, why did they do this to African people or African descendants? When you see that at some point, they were actually kidnapping fellow Europeans from the streets in Britain, people of lesser means, to take them to work on the plantations in the Caribbean. So some Europeans would be missing relatives. Oh, what happened to this? Without realizing that fellow European has been enslaved taken to work in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
They would go to some prisons and have deals with wardens to hand over these inmates to be kidnapped and shipped to the Caribbean.
Speaking of which, I mean, it actually happened. It actually happened.
A surprise. No, they did.
It actually happened.
Eric Williams' book.
No, I mean the concept you gave actually happened. What do you think built Australia? It was convict labor.
Yep.
They initially kept them on boats, but when they saw that idea was no longer feasible, they moved them down to Australia. Now imagine the dregs of society, your worst criminals, are moved somewhere else, and they then see people who are indigenous there and call them barbarians. Because, I mean, you just need to look at Australia is the perfect example. It almost happened as well in Sierra Leone. Thank God for the Anopheles mosquito. Because, I mean, they took, the initial idea was they took 600 people there, and in 6 months, the mosquito just decimated all of them, you know. And so they never had an Australia in Sierra Leone. So it does happen. It does happen. And I think the faster Africans wake up to the idea that when you're dealing with them, make it transactional.
And when you say them, I want people to think of capital.
Capitalists.
Was that capital could do that to Europeans as well.
Yes.
And that's what Eric Williams superbly puts in his book.
Yes. It's funny you say that, because I was just, as you were both talking, I was remembering Angela Davis's speech, and that is something that she said there. I just put it up.
Yeah.
And she said that, do not be mistaken, all this oppression, all the wars, everything, capitalism.
Yeah. Make it transactional.
Yes. And
you want this is what you pay for it.
Yes. And which is a good advice for Africa, right?
Yeah.
Which is a brilliant advice for Africa. And this is what African leaders should do.
I mean, what is currently happening is they tell you the price. No, this is our price. And here's the beautiful thing. You have China, to a lesser extent Russia, as bargaining chip. Well, this is what China is offering me. What are you willing to pay for it?
Yep.
And then you get yourself a fair deal.
You get the highest bidder.
Exactly.
Which is what Rosalind, we were talking about him last week. That is what he does on the Nkrumah negotiation terms that he did with the Volta project. He comes in and he says, no, you're giving us a better deal. And they sit there and haggle, and they try the West. I forget the company. Remind me again, the company that worked with them on the Volta project. Yes, Kaiser. And Kaiser management tries to swindle them, but he stands firm. And they got 3 times the price that Nkrumah negotiated. 3 times, times 3.
Right. Jerry Rawlings.
So yes, Rawling. I keep calling him Rawlings. Jay Rawlings. Brother Alimadi, Brother Milton. Last words on Sharpeville Massacre and South Africa, because we know that the struggle continues in South Africa. Malema is out here keeping some people in check and fighting and being brave and courageous about it. But any last words on Sharpeville in South Africa?
I think Sharpeville showed that our people are willing to be involved in struggle if the objectives are well articulated. In this case, Sobukwe managed to articulate that we can bring the system down, bringing their own laws. He had studied the contradictions in the system. He realized there's no way, if the majority of the population turned out, they would be able to arrest them, right? So that would overwhelm and bring the system down. So my main point on that is that it means people in any country where the struggle is occurring, and that pretty much is every country in the world, right?
Sure.
Because
Sure.
capital is predominant. You also have to analyze your domestic environment and see what works. I'm surprised that in many African countries, people in opposition have not yet organized effectively against the World Bank and the IMF.
Yeah.
That are the pillars of 21st century neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
It will work. How do I know that? Because just us here with Ugandan comrades marching and protesting in front of the IMF and World Bank, they're pleading with us to stop those protests. They've been inviting us to meetings with them, which we've attended, on Zoom. And to me, at some point, I stopped attending. I said, these meetings are useless. They're just trying to pacify them, to prevent them from continuing the protest. And showing two things. Number one, these debts are not supposed to be paid back, right? Because if we pay back, then they lose money. It's supposed to be perpetual, number one. So therefore, these debts are not to develop African countries, but to maintain autocrats. In Uganda, it's Museveni. In Congo, it was Mobutu, So pick a struggle like that, very specific, and boom, be involved.
Brother
So
Milton,
look at your country. What's involved? Pick that struggle.
Let's not even call it a pick that struggle. Let's put out the call to action now to Africans globally that we should pick these true struggles. These two items, IMF and World Bank out of Africa. Let's strategize. All the think tanks out there, African think tanks, called organizations, Pan-African organizations. Let us see what we're going to call it and how we're going to do it. But that is our goal now. Let's start there. Let's get IMF and the World Bank out of Africa.
And then take it from there.
Adesoji, last words.
Yes. Again, Sharpeville shows what is possible when people put their minds together and articulate, just like Brother Milton said. But furthermore, these are people who were operating in quote unquote darkness of information. They had no idea of how things were going on outside of South Africa. But they knew that within South Africa, they wanted to make a change. Where am I going with this? They are on the run at the moment. When I say they're on the run, capital is on the run at the moment. The age of social media has democratized struggle. So which is, if I don't want to engage with you, I will not engage. So instead, what do? They take someone who looks like you and put that person in front of you. Now it's time to ask that person who is sat in front of you, what do you truly represent? That's me. You're muted.
You're muted. You accidentally muted.
Thank you about that. That's an interesting one. That goes to, I'm thinking the Black Caucus. We're in the US. Ask them what they're doing for you. I'm thinking the African leaders. Ask them what they're doing. The people, the African people, ask them what they're doing for you. When they come by in their trucks, giving you money during campaign season and giving you all kinds of promises, ask them for their resume. What have they done? Because if someone is at the point where they're running, at that point, they should have done something in their community to show what they will do for the rest of the people. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. I mean, we can talk all week, we can talk all day about these issues, but we're only limited to an hour and a half. We thank you all for joining us, and we remind you again, there you go, asanteni kwa kuwa nasi, which is thank you in Kiswahili for being with us. Yes. And we ask you to support Kumbukeni by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@Kumbukeni, or join our Patreon family at patreon.com/Kumbukeni. Yes. Again, today we remember the Sharpeville Massacre, the families and the African people, our brothers and sisters who lost their lives. We honor them. And we remember Robert Sobukwe. We honor him and we thank him for the sacrifices he made for our people. Thank you. Kwaherini.
Asante sana. Aluta continua.
Odaro.